China did not weaponize its currency to replace the US dollar. It weaponized it to make American financial pressure less effective. That distinction explains almost every major financial decision Beijing has made over the past decade. Most discussions about de-dollarization begin with ideology. They frame it as a contest for prestige, reserve currency status, or national pride. Beijing's actual concern was operational. A system that could process global payments could also interrupt them. The same network that connected international commerce could be used to isolate countries, companies, and banks from it. That risk stopped being theoretical when financial sanctions became one of Washington's preferred foreign policy tools. Every major sanctions package carried the same message. Access to the dollar-based financial system depended on political alignment as much as commercial activity. A bank could be profitable, connected, and internationally active, yet still lose access to critical payment channels if it crossed the wrong political line. China watched carefully. Its economy had become deeply integrated into global trade, yet most cross-border transactions still relied on infrastructure built around the dollar. Even when two countries traded without American goods, payments often moved through institutions connected to the U.S. financial system. Efficiency came with dependence. Dependence creates leverage. Beijing concluded that military strength alone could not protect a country whose international payments could still be disrupted from abroad. Economic security required financial redundancy, not isolation, an alternative. That conclusion produced a strategy that looked technical on the surface and geopolitical underneath. China expanded international Yuan settlement programs. It signed bilateral currency swap agreements with foreign central banks. It built its own cross-border payment infrastructure. It encouraged energy exporters, commodity suppliers, and manufacturing partners to invoice transactions in yuan instead of dollars. Viewed separately, these appeared to be routine financial reforms. Viewed together, they form a coherent attempt to reduce exposure to a payment system China did not control. The critical point is that Beijing never needed most of the world to abandon the dollar. It only needed enough trade to survive a period of financial pressure. That is a much lower threshold. A reserve currency must be trusted almost everywhere. A strategic currency only needs to function where national interests require it, which is why the campaign focused first on China's largest trading relationships. Russia, Gulf energy exporters, Southeast Asian partners, and participants in the Belt and Road Initiative became testing grounds for yuan settlement. Each transaction settled outside the dollar system was small in isolation. The cumulative effect mattered more than any individual deal. The infrastructure followed the trade. China developed the Cross-Border Interbank Payment System, known as CIPS, to handle international yuan transactions. It remained far smaller than SWIFT, but size was not the immediate objective. The objective was continuity. If access to existing networks became constrained, Beijing wanted another rail already in operation rather than one still being designed. This is where the word weaponized becomes useful. China did not weaponize the yuan by forcing other countries to hold it. It weaponized the yuan by turning it into a geopolitical backup system. The currency became a tool for preserving trade under pressure. A country that can still buy energy, sell goods, and move payments during a sanctions crisis possesses a form of strategic resilience that pure military power cannot provide. That resilience is easier to build gradually than suddenly. Beijing understood that financial networks depend on habits. Companies invoice in the currencies they already use. Banks clear payments through systems they already trust. Governments hold reserves that already have deep markets. Changing those habits requires years of repetition, not a single announcement. The result is a campaign that often appears slower than its critics expect, and more deliberate than its supporters admit. China is not trying to trigger a dramatic collapse of the dollar order. A collapse would damage China's own export economy. It is trying to create enough parallel capacity that the dollar becomes optional whenever Chinese strategic interests are at risk. That objective is narrower than replacing the dollar, and far more achievable. Once that logic is accepted, many developments that appeared disconnected begin to align. The expansion of Yuan settlement agreements, the construction of alternative payment rails, the promotion of digital currency projects, and the steady reduction of vulnerability to Western-controlled financial infrastructure cease to look like separate policies. They become different components of the same long-term design. That design did not emerge because China expected an immediate financial confrontation. It emerged because Beijing concluded that waiting until such a confrontation arrived would already be too late. The infrastructure only matters if other countries decide to use it. That was always the harder challenge. Building a payment network is an engineering project, convincing governments, central banks, and multinational companies to trust that network is a political process measured in years. China understood that payment systems follow trade, not speeches. That is why Beijing never launched its financial strategy with a campaign against the dollar. Instead, it expanded commercial relationships first. By the time discussions about de-dollarization became common headlines, China had already become the largest trading partner for well over 100 countries. That position changed the conversation. Nations buying machinery from China, exporting raw materials to China, or participating in Chinese infrastructure projects suddenly had a practical reason to settle more transactions in yuan. The decision was economic before it became geopolitical. Every international transaction carries exchange costs. A Brazilian company selling soybeans to China traditionally converted Brazilian reais into US dollars before those dollars were exchanged into Chinese yuan. Every conversion meant additional fees, exchange rate exposure, and dependence on dollar liquidity. If both parties agreed to settle directly in yuan, one layer of that process disappeared. The savings were not always dramatic, the strategic implications were. A payment that never entered the dollar system could not be interrupted by restrictions placed on that system. That difference became increasingly important after successive rounds of financial sanctions demonstrated how quickly access to dollar clearing could become a geopolitical instrument. China responded by expanding bilateral currency swap agreements with foreign central banks. These agreements sound technical because they are. Two central banks agree to exchange currencies with one another, allowing commercial banks inside each country to obtain liquidity without first purchasing dollars in global markets. During normal conditions, they reduce transaction costs. During periods of financial stress, they provide an alternative source of funding. The mechanism is simple, the consequences are not. Every new swap agreement reduced one more reason to rely exclusively on the dollar. None of them challenged the dollar individually. Together, they gradually reduced the cost of operating outside it. The same logic shaped the expansion of CIPS, China's Cross-Border Interbank Payment System. It is often described as China's replacement for SWIFT, but that comparison misses an important distinction. SWIFT is primarily a secure messaging network. It tells financial institutions how to communicate payment instructions. CIPS combines messaging with yuan clearing, allowing participating banks to settle transactions directly in China's currency. That difference matters because Beijing was not trying to build a mirror image of SWIFT. It was solving a different problem. China wanted a payment infrastructure capable of functioning even if access to Western-controlled financial channels became restricted. The objective was continuity, not duplication. Critics often point out that CIPS remains much smaller than SWIFT. They are correct. The comparison is also incomplete. SWIFT processes transactions across virtually every major currency in the global economy. CIPS was never designed to replace all international finance. It only needed to become large enough to support the portion of global trade connected to China and its partners. Success was measured by resilience rather than dominance. That is an entirely different benchmark. The Belt and Road Initiative quietly reinforced this strategy. Chinese banks financed ports, railways, power plants, industrial parks, and transportation corridors across Asia, Africa, Latin America, and parts of Europe. Infrastructure projects naturally generated long-term financial relationships. Loans had to be serviced, equipment had to be purchased, contractors required payment, supply chains developed around these investments. Over time, settling some of those transactions in yuan became less unusual. Habits began to change. Financial systems rarely transform because governments announce a new policy. They transform because businesses discover that a different method is cheaper, faster, or more reliable. Beijing consistently targeted those practical incentives instead of demanding ideological loyalty. That approach explains another decision that initially puzzled many observers. China accelerated development of the digital yuan, officially known as the e-CNY. Outside China, discussions often focused on consumer payments inside Chinese cities. The larger strategic question received less attention. A programmable digital currency issued directly by a central bank could eventually simplify certain forms of cross-border settlement while reducing dependence on existing payment intermediaries. The technology alone will not overturn the global financial order. China understands that. Technology is only useful when supported by trade, banking relationships, legal frameworks, and international confidence. The digital yuan is therefore one component inside a much larger architecture rather than a standalone solution. Every piece serves the same objective: currency swaps, alternative payment infrastructure, digital settlement technology, expanding yuan-denominated trade. Each initiative appears modest when examined individually. Together, they reveal a deliberate attempt to reduce China's exposure to external financial pressure without forcing an immediate confrontation with the existing monetary order. That measured pace often creates the illusion that little is changing. History suggests otherwise. Financial systems rarely collapse overnight. They evolve gradually until the accumulation of small adjustments becomes impossible to ignore. By the time that transition becomes obvious, most of the structural work has already been completed. China appears to have understood that principle from the very beginning. The architecture was never built to make headlines. It was built to function quietly until the day it might be needed. One objection appears every time this discussion begins. The yuan still accounts for only a small share of global foreign exchange reserves, while the US dollar remains dominant in international payments, sovereign debt markets, and central bank holdings. Those facts are accurate. They also answer a different question. The assumption behind most criticism is that China is trying to become the next United States. The evidence suggests something narrower. Beijing is trying to reduce strategic dependence on a system it does not control. Those are not the same objective, and confusing them leads analysts toward the wrong conclusions. Reserve currency dominance demands conditions that China has never fully embraced. Investors want unrestricted capital movement, deep and transparent financial markets, an independent legal system, and confidence that governments will not unexpectedly alter financial rules. The United States, despite its own political and fiscal challenges, still provides most of those conditions at a scale no other economy currently matches. China knows this. It also knows it does not need to replicate every feature of the dollar system to achieve its own strategic goals. That distinction explains why Beijing has accepted a slower pace of yuan internationalization than many observers expected. If replacing the dollar were the primary objective, China would likely accelerate financial liberalization, remove more capital controls, and allow markets greater freedom in determining exchange rates. Instead, it has done the opposite in several areas. Economic stability has repeatedly taken priority over reserve currency ambition. At first glance, that appears contradictory. It is not. A government seeking financial sovereignty values control differently from a government seeking global monetary leadership. China has consistently chosen domestic stability over rapid international acceptance. That choice limits how quickly the yuan can expand globally, but it also protects Beijing's ability to respond to economic shocks without surrendering policy flexibility. My read on this is that many Western analyses continue measuring China against an objective Beijing never fully adopted. They evaluate whether the yuan can replace the dollar, while Beijing appears focused on ensuring it can survive without complete dependence on the dollar. Those are different scorecards. The events following Russia's invasion of Ukraine reinforced that calculation. Western sanctions froze hundreds of billions of dollars in Russian foreign exchange reserves and disconnected several Russian banks from parts of the international financial system. Regardless of how one views those sanctions politically, governments around the world observe the same operational reality. Reserve assets held abroad could become inaccessible, payment channels could become restricted, financial integration carried strategic vulnerabilities. That lesson extended far beyond Moscow. Countries maintaining neutral relationships with both Washington and Beijing began asking practical questions. Should all foreign reserves remain concentrated in one currency? Should every international transaction rely on a single payment architecture? Would diversification reduce future geopolitical risk? Those questions benefited China without requiring China to persuade anyone through ideology. Experience became the argument. Trade patterns began reflecting that gradual shift. China increased the use of yuan in energy purchases from some suppliers. Bilateral trade agreements increasingly included local currency settlement provisions. Central banks slowly diversified portions of their reserve portfolios, even when those adjustments remained relatively modest. None of these developments ended dollar dominance. They reduced exclusivity. That difference matters because financial power rarely disappears in one dramatic event. It erodes through incremental adjustments that appear insignificant individually but become meaningful collectively. History offers several examples. The British pound did not lose its international position in a single year. Its decline stretched across decades, influenced by changing trade flows, economic capacity, war, debt accumulation, and the emergence of larger financial markets elsewhere. Even after the United States became the world's leading economic power, sterling continued playing an important international role for many years. Monetary transitions rarely resemble political revolutions. They resemble slow reallocations of confidence. China appears to have studied that history carefully. Rather than demanding immediate acceptance of the yuan, Beijing has concentrated on expanding the number of situations where using the yuan becomes practical. Every additional central bank swap line, every commodity contract settled in yuan, every multinational company willing to invoice Chinese customers directly in local currency, and every financial institution connected to alternative payment infrastructure slightly widens that practical space. What I keep coming back to is the consistency of the timeline. Policies announced years apart often appear disconnected when viewed individually. Seen together, they reveal remarkable continuity. Different administrations, different economic conditions, and different external crises have not significantly altered the direction of China's financial strategy. That consistency suggests long-term planning rather than reactive policymaking. It also explains why measuring success only by the yuan's share of global reserves misses the larger picture. The strategy was never designed to win everything. It was designed to ensure China could no longer lose everything through a financial system controlled elsewhere. The most important consequence of China's financial strategy is not that the dollar disappears. It is that the dollar gradually loses its monopoly over political leverage. Those outcomes are very different, and understanding the difference changes how the entire debate should be viewed. The global financial system is moving towards something less centralized than the one that emerged after the end of the Cold War. That does not mean American influence vanishes. It means countries with sufficient economic scale are investing in ways to reduce their exposure to decisions made outside their borders. China simply began that process earlier than most. The discussion often focuses on currencies because currencies are visible. The deeper transformation is infrastructure. Payment systems, settlement mechanisms, reserve diversification, central bank cooperation, and digital financial networks rarely dominate headlines, yet these are the foundations that determine how money moves when political relationships begin to deteriorate. Financial power has always depended on infrastructure. Control the infrastructure and you influence behavior without deploying military force. That principle shaped the rise of the dollar after the Second World War. The Bretton Woods institutions, the expansion of dollar liquidity, the depth of American capital markets, and the global acceptance of U.S. Treasury securities created an environment where using the dollar became the most efficient choice for nearly everyone. Efficiency eventually became dependence. China's response has not been to destroy that architecture. It has been to construct enough parallel infrastructure that dependence becomes a choice instead of a necessity. That objective remains incomplete. The dollar continues to dominate global reserves, international lending, commodity pricing, and foreign exchange markets. American financial institutions remain deeply integrated into virtually every major economy. The liquidity available in dollar markets is unmatched, and no competing currency currently offers the same combination of scale, transparency, and global confidence. Those advantages are real. They are also not permanent by definition. History rarely preserves financial leadership indefinitely. Economic systems evolve alongside trade patterns, technological change, demographic shifts, and geopolitical competition. No reserve currency remains dominant because history guarantees it. It remains dominant because the conditions supporting it continue to exist. China appears to be positioning itself for a future in which those conditions become more fragmented rather than more unified. Whether that future arrives quickly or gradually depends on forces extending well beyond Beijing. American fiscal policy, interest rate cycles, technological innovation, regional conflicts, demographic trends, and the policy choices of dozens of other governments will all influence the pace of change. No single country controls that outcome, not even China. What China can control is its own level of vulnerability. That has been the consistent theme running through every major financial initiative Beijing has introduced over the past decade. Currency swap agreements reduce dependence on dollar liquidity. CIPS provides an alternative channel for cross-border yuan settlements. The digital yuan explores new settlement technologies. Expanding trade invoicing in yuan encourages commercial relationships that remain functional even during periods of geopolitical tension. None of these measures guarantee immunity from financial pressure. Together, they reduce exposure. There is an important difference between resisting sanctions completely and making sanctions less effective. China's strategy appears focused on the second objective because it is substantially more achievable. Absolute independence is unrealistic in an interconnected global economy. Relative resilience is not. I think the more accurate framing is that Beijing has been preparing for optionality rather than supremacy. Much of the public conversation still assumes China is competing to inherit America's financial position. The evidence suggests it is building enough independent capacity to ensure that its own economy cannot be strategically constrained as easily as it once could. That is a quieter ambition. It may also prove to be the more realistic one. If this trajectory continues, the future international monetary system may not revolve around a single dominant currency replacing another. It could become a more fragmented environment where several major currencies coexist, each serving different regions, industries, and strategic relationships. The dollar would remain central, but no longer uncontested in every domain. That transition, if it continues, will almost certainly be measured in decades rather than years, which is exactly why it is so easy to underestimate while it is happening. The architecture China has been constructing was never designed to produce one dramatic headline announcing the end of dollar dominance. It was designed to produce something much less visible, a world in which Beijing has credible financial alternatives before it ever needs to use them. By the time such alternatives become obvious to everyone, the difficult work of building them will already have been completed. Find a flaw in this argument. Seriously, I want to see it.